This presentation is about an extremely small point in the inflection of Algonquian verb forms. These are the independent indicative forms that mean I fetch him or her in Cree, Menominee, and Munsee. The forms show the same pattern in the three languages. There's a verb stem, a first-person prefix, the direct theme sign, and a suffix W. The question for this presentation is what exactly this W signifies. One possible answer is that the W indicates that the object is an animate third person, him or her. This is a view taken by Bloomfield and Pentland, among others. The other possible answer is that the W indicates that the first-person subject is singular, I rather than we. This is a view taken by Goddard. These are two completely different ways of understanding what the W signifies, and I'm not sure that any of these authors have really explained why they opt for one view over the other. So the purpose of this presentation is to take a closer look, and ultimately to argue that Goddard's view makes more sense. The W suffix is a singular subject marker, not a third-person object marker. Something that should be made clear from the start is that there are actually two distinct W suffixes. There's a W that always co-occurs with a person prefix, like in these forms. I'll call this prefixing W. And there's a distinct W that always appears without a person prefix, as in the forms that mean she or he fetches someone else. Notice that before this other W, the direct theme sign changes from A to A. This is a process that Goddard calls umlaut, and it's triggered only by this other W suffix, so I'll call the other suffix umlauting W. It's well recognized in the literature that these two W's are distinct morphemes, and it's clear that the umlauting W is indeed a third-person marker. In particular, it's a genderless and numberless third-person marker. But that analysis doesn't necessarily extend to the prefixing W. In this presentation, I'm concerned only with the status of the prefixing W. As I said earlier, this W could potentially be understood as either an animate third-person object marker or a singular subject marker. I'll start by briefly showing the rationales for these two distinct analyses, and then I'll argue that one analysis is actually preferable to the other. So first, why might we conclude that W is a singular subject marker? Here are some Cree TA forms that include the W. I see him or her, you singular see him or her, and an unspecified actor sees him or her. Let's compare those with some similar forms that don't include the W. We exclusive see him or her, we inclusive see him or her, and you plural see him or her. In these forms, the slot where we'd otherwise see W is instead occupied by a plural subject marker. If you compare the form that means I see him or her with the form that means we see him or her, the difference between singular I and plural we correlates with just one difference in the morphology. The suffix W appears when the subject is singular, while the suffix non appears when the subject is plural. It's the use of W rather than non that tells us that the first-person subject is singular rather than plural. The overall observation here is that W appears whenever the higher-ranked argument is singular, or numberless in the case of the unspecified actor. And that's why we might think of W as a singular subject marker. Or more accurately, as a marker that indicates that the higher-ranked argument, indexed by the prefix, is non-plural. Alternatively, why might we conclude that W is an animate third-person object marker? Here again are a couple of Cree TA forms that include the W. I see him or her, you singular see him or her. Alongside forms like these, there are also forms that show a suffix N in the same position as the W. We see this with TI verbs, I see it, you singular see it, and in Cree we also see this with AI verbs, I sleep, you singular sleep. When we compare the forms in this way, the generalization is that we see W when the object is an animate third person, him or her, and we see N either when there's an inanimate object, it, or no object at all. From that perspective, it looks like the W is an animate third-person object marker. Or, more accurately, a marker that indicates that the lower-ranked argument, not indexed by the prefix, is an animate third person. So we seem to have a bit of a paradox. If we take a form with W, like the form that means I see him or her, and compare it with a form like we see him or her, it looks like the contrast between the suffix non and the suffix w is telling us whether the subject is plural we or singular I. If we instead compare it with a form like I see it, it looks like the contrast between the suffix w and the suffix n is telling us whether the object is animate him or her or inanimate it. But I want to argue that there isn't actually a paradox here, because one of these two comparisons is not actually legitimate and doesn't actually tell us anything about the meaning of w. Let's remind ourselves first about how exactly we identify the meaning of an inflectional morpheme. Inflectional forms are organized into paradigms, and the meaning of any particular morpheme depends on the contrasts that that morpheme enters into within its paradigm. Think about a Latin example. We have a class 1 noun that means poet, and a class 2 noun that means lord. These two nouns inflect with different paradigms. Looking at the class 1 paradigm, how do we know that the suffix a is a nominative singular marker? Well, it's because we can see minimal pairs. The same noun stem inflects with a when it's nominative, when it's accusative, and I when it's genitive. The suffix a gets its nominative singular meaning from minimal pairs such as these. But that only applies within a paradigm. It doesn't apply across paradigms. The class 1 nominative suffix a doesn't get any meaning from a contrast with the class 2 nominative suffix us, because these two suffixes don't actually contrast with each other. There are no minimal pairs because the two suffixes appear on different noun stems. The class 1 paradigm and the class 2 paradigm are two separate universes of inflectional contrasts, and it's only within each of these paradigms that we can compare forms to determine the meanings of the inflectional morphemes. Think now about how this would play out in Cree. We have a TA verb that means see someone, and a TI verb that means see something. These are two distinct paradigms. The TA inflection appears on TA stems, the TI inflection appears on TI stems. Within the TA paradigm, we have minimal pairs in which W appears when the subject is singular, and some other suffix appears when the subject is plural. So within the TA paradigm, the function of the W is to indicate that the subject is singular. Similarly, within the TI paradigm, we have minimal pairs in which N appears when the subject is singular, and some other suffix appears when the subject is plural. So within the TI paradigm, the function of the N, parallel to the W, is to indicate that the subject is singular. And that's all we can conclude about the meaning of W and N. We can't make a comparison between forms with W and forms with N because the two forms belong to different paradigms. They don't contrast with each other. There are no minimal pairs. Not only is there a difference between W and N, but there's also a difference in the stem and the theme sign. So the W suffix doesn't get any meaning from a contrast with the N suffix because the W suffix doesn't contrast with the N suffix. The two suffixes belong to separate universes of inflectional contrasts. So we're left with Goddard's answer. W is a singular subject marker, not an animate third-person object marker. At this point, you might not be fully satisfied with that answer because it still feels like the difference between W and N should mean something. So another point that I'd like to make is that the meaning of an inflectional morpheme is not affected by any allomorphy that applies to that morpheme. Allomorphs of a morpheme have the same meaning regardless of how they're conditioned. Let's just think about the forms with the first-person singular subject. TA, I see him or her, and TI, I see it. The object of the TA form is explicitly singular because if it were plural, the form would be nwabamawuk, with the plural peripheral suffix uk, rather than just nwabamaw. This is another kind of minimal pair. The overt peripheral suffix indicates that the object is plural, and the absence of an overt peripheral suffix indicates that the object is singular. This is the kind of situation in which it's legitimate to posit a zero morpheme, when the absence of an overt morpheme explicitly signifies a particular meaning. So both of these TA forms actually have a peripheral suffix, animate singular 0 or animate plural uk. For the TI verb, on the other hand, the object in Cree can be understood as either singular or plural. So there's no contrast here, which means there's just no peripheral suffix at all. The verb form doesn't convey any information about the number of its object. Now we have the ingredients to understand what's going on with the difference between W and N. As Goddard has argued, W and N are actually just two allomorphs of the same morpheme. The morpheme is a singular subject marker, as we already concluded from looking at the TA and TI paradigms. The singular subject marker is realized as its W allomorph when it is followed by an animate third-person peripheral suffix. And it's realized as its N allomorph elsewhere, at least in Cree. Most of the other languages have a third allomorph, but the overall principle is still the same. The difference between W and N is not meaningful. It's a matter of allomorphy, triggered by the following peripheral suffix. Now, since the W allomorph of the singular subject marker is triggered by a following animate third-person peripheral suffix, this might seem to give the W suffix itself a bit of an animate third-person flavor. But we need to remember that the conditioning of an allomorph of a morpheme is separate from the meaning of the morpheme. Think about the English morpheme persuade. This morpheme has an allomorph persuase that appears before the adjective suffix iv. But that doesn't mean that the allomorph persuase itself has adjectival meaning. It's conditioned by an adjective suffix, but its actual meaning isn't affected by this conditioning. Its meaning is the same as that of persuade. And it's the same for W. It's conditioned by an animate third-person peripheral suffix, but its actual meaning isn't affected by this conditioning. Its meaning is the same as that of N. It's a singular subject marker. One final argument can be given to support the view of W as a singular subject marker. It's quite simple. If W doesn't express singular subject, then nothing does, and we incorrectly expect the number of the subject to be ambiguous. Think about these Cree forms with a second-person subject and a third-person object. If the W is a third-person object marker, as in Bloomfield's analysis, then the second-person prefix ki is actually the only morpheme in this form that indexes the second-person subject. And we know from elsewhere in the system what happens in cases like that. This is the TA form that means you see us. It consists of the stem, a first-person theme sign, a first-person plural suffix, and a second-person prefix. So this is a form where it's uncontroversially the case that the second-person subject is indexed only by the person prefix. And the result is that the number of the second person is ambiguous. It could be either you singular or you plural. But in the forms with W, the number of the second person is not ambiguous. It's explicitly singular. This means that the second person can't only be being indexed by the prefix in these forms, because if it was, its number should be ambiguous, but it's not. So there must be something that's explicitly marking the second person subject as singular, and the only thing that could be doing that is W. So going back to the beginning, it might seem like the prefixing W could be analyzed as either a third-person object marker or a singular subject marker, but when we think more closely about how inflectional paradigms work, I think it becomes clear that Goddard's view, in which W is a singular subject marker, is preferable to Bloomfield's view, in which W is a third-person object marker. Under Goddard's view, the properties of W that might make us think it's a third-person object marker are actually the result of allomorphy, triggered by the following peripheral suffix, which is indeed a third-person object marker. But the W itself is just an allomorph of the singular subject marker. Or, to be more accurate, the non-plural subject marker, since it marks both singular subjects and unspecified subjects. I'd like to briefly mention a couple of implications of this conclusion. The first is that in some languages, such as Passamaquoddy, there is a zero equivalent of W. If we compare some Passamaquoddy TA forms with singular or unspecified subjects with the equivalent forms with plural subjects, we see that non-plural number is explicitly marked by leaving out a suffix in the position where plural number is marked. That's equivalent to saying that there's a zero non-plural subject suffix, which occurs in the same places where languages like Cree, Menominee, and Delaware have W. The non-plural subject suffix is truly 0 in Passamaquoddy. Even if we make the object plural, which adds a word final peripheral suffix, the non-plural subject suffix is still 0, so there doesn't seem to be an underlying W lying around at all. Things get a bit more complicated if we look at Ojibwe and Miami, Illinois. Here are the Ojibwe TA forms for a non-plural subject, and here are the forms for a plural subject. The thing that jumps out is that the forms with a singular subject, I or U singular, have a 0 singular suffix, like in Passamaquoddy. But the form with an unspecified subject has W, like in Cree, Menominee, and Delaware. If we see this morpheme as a non-plural subject marker, as in Goddard's analysis, then it's easy to describe what's going on here. All we have to say is that the original W, which was a non-plural subject marker, has split into two morphemes in Ojibwe. 0 for singular subjects, as in I see them and you singular see them, and W for unspecified subjects, as in unspecified sees them. Ojibwe has taken the two meanings that fall under non-plural, i.e. singular and unspecified, and given each meaning its own morpheme. That's a straightforward analysis, and indeed it's exactly the analysis that is given by Nichols. If we instead followed Bloomfield in seeing the W suffix as an animate third-person object marker, it would be very hard to describe what's going on in Ojibwe because the object is an animate third person in all of these forms. There's no way to explain why some animate third-person objects would be marked by 0, while others would be marked by W. This is a place where the third-person object analysis clearly falls down, because it makes the language seem like it's acting irregularly or illogically, when in fact it's not. It's doing something that makes perfect sense, as long as we recognize that this is actually a subject marker, not an object marker. One last implication involves the structure of direct and inverse forms. Think about just this one Cree TA direct form, Nwabamawak, I see them. If the W suffix is a singular subject marker, then the central agreement, which is the prefix-suffix combination, as a whole indexes the highest ranked argument. The prefix indexes the first person, and the suffix indicates that the first person is singular. So under this analysis, the Goddard analysis, the person hierarchy governs the central agreement as a whole, the prefix and the suffix together. If the W suffix is instead an animate third-person object marker, then the central agreement, the prefix-suffix combination, is actually indexing both arguments. The prefix indexes the first person, and the suffix indexes the third person. So under this analysis, the Bloomfield analysis, the person hierarchy governs only the prefix, and the central suffix, the W, just does its own thing. What we get from the Goddard analysis is a deeper claim about how the system works, since it recognizes a unity in the function of the prefix and the central suffix that isn't there under Bloomfield's analysis. And I argued at last year's conference that if we adopt Goddard's view, we get a better understanding of the structure of direct and inverse forms and the way these forms change over time. I won't go into any details now, but I would argue that this is another place where the system makes significantly more sense if you view the W as a singular subject marker rather than an animate object marker. To conclude, I've argued that the prefixing W is best understood as a singular subject marker, not an animate object marker. More accurately, the prefixing W indicates that the argument indexed by the prefix is not plural. The apparent contrast between W and N, which has led to a widespread view of W as an animate object marker, is actually not a contrast at all, but rather an artifact of allomorphy triggered by the following peripheral suffix, as Goddard has proposed. This is admittedly a very subtle point, but at the same time it's a fairly fundamental part of the system of verb inflection, and I think it's beneficial in lots of ways, from linguistic analysis to language pedagogy, if we can see this system as something that actually makes sense. And in a small way, I think that sorting out these two views on the W suffix helps us to do that. Thank you very much for listening.